Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. Well, today, Mark Calhoun is our guest. He's a retired U.S. Army helicopter pilot and planner. He now works full-time as a military historian for World War II Museum in New Orleans, and he's joining us to talk about the German counteroffensives in Tunisia, including the infamous Battle of Kasserine Pass. Before I bring him in, if you're new to the channel and views are going up recently, there's something happening on YouTube. Thank you to your interaction there. If you're new, please don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you get notifications. And as always, all the information you need is in the description below. You can open it up to get the links to my guests' books and their websites and social media accounts, etc., etc. Without further ado, I'll bring Mark in. So good afternoon, Mark. How are you today?
I'm great. We had a nice rain this morning, so there's a nice fresh coat of rain on New Orleans today.
Brilliant. So Kasserine Pass is one of those battles that, you know, everyone's got an opinion about it. It's been talked about for years, and all sorts of mythology and language gets used around it. And I know you're obviously going to present on the wider picture of that, but do you think it is about time we went back to basics and kind of studied some of these events again freshly and kind of rid ourselves of all the mythology?
Yeah, I do. I think I kind of look at revisionism or revisionist history the same as you do. I think all history is revisionist, whether it's consciously revisionist or not. But I think the important thing is that as historical memory evolves and as new work comes out, and as people age and mature and reflect on things they've done before or on their experience and how that informs what they're writing or studying, I think it's really important to go back and reevaluate things. And I've certainly done that a few different points in my short career over Kasserine Pass.
And it's, again, we'll find it's about the context. It's like, I mean, I've got guests in my house right now who are eating with Mag. Villa Bocage came up in a conversation. And Villa Bocage is a fascinating battle, but to me, to understand it, you've got to look into it in the context of what happened before it, what happened afterwards. What's happening in the evolution of armored engagements in Normandy. And the same thing with Kasserine Pass, as we'll find out, is that it's not. It can't and shouldn't be treated in isolation. It's part of a wider situation that bears examination. But anyway, you've got your PowerPoint. We'll bring it up. You're in charge of it tonight, folks. If you have questions, we'll kind of do them as we go along. There's not many slides, but Mark is going to take us through the Axis offensive, but feel free to jump in with your comments and questions. But basically, over to you, Mark.
Great. All right. Thanks. I really appreciate the intro, and it's great to be back on World War II TV. I'll just kind of roll right into it, but I did want to mention just a couple of things. So I do have kind of a long history with this Kasserine Pass event in World War II. I wrote my master's thesis when I was an Army major at Fort Leavenworth in 2003. So that was a long time ago. I wrote my master's thesis about Kasserine Pass. And at the time, there was a book called America's First Battles. It was a really important part of the history curriculum at the Command and General Staff College. And so it's kind of this litany of first battles and different conflicts that the United States has been involved in, and sort of established this historical continuity of this army that's never really ready and always loses in an embarrassing fashion in its first battles. And so it kind of created this atmosphere that you view Kasserine Pass through. And that definitely influenced my thinking, just my lack of maturity and background. I was just an Army major who had always kind of been interested in history, but I'm finally sort of really studying it. And so I just approached my study of this campaign from really kind of a specific perspective. And it's nobody's fault but my own, but over time I've kind of learned more about history and World War II history, and I've kind of broadened my way of thinking about it. And so now I guess I just kind of look at it really differently. But I think the important thing is that you kind of have these two different ways you can look at Kasserine Pass. And the most predominant way, and probably the way that most people only really ever see, is that it was this really devastating defeat for the Americans, instead of viewing it as an Allied victory that came on the heels of some pretty costly defeats in the early engagements. So that's kind of basically where we're going to go with this. And I'll just go ahead and say, too, that it's probably not the hottest take out there. I mean, there are certainly other people who've made this argument. So I'm not trying to present the idea that I've come up with anything new or original. So to a degree, this may just be a reflection of my own learning over the years. But I have had some pretty interesting insights on all this as I've gone through it that other people might find interesting too. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the strategic setting, this really is just to show that a whole lot of stuff needed to happen in a really short period of time. And I know everybody's aware that the U.S. Army was very small before the war started. And we started building it up gradually. We didn't really want to get involved in the war, and our early efforts were more to support the combatants with equipment through Lend-Lease than it was to build up our own army, although we were doing that as well. So this is just kind of a snapshot of some dates that'll help give us all an idea where we were at. We didn't create our first armored division until July of 1940, and they're going to be in combat against the Germans 2 years later, a little over 2 years later. But a whole year after that, in June of 41, the Army still has only 66 medium tanks in the entire Army inventory, which is pretty remarkable. The Louisiana maneuvers, its armored units are fighting M3 Stuarts, M3 Grants. Their largest AT guns, anti-tank guns, are 37 millimeter, and their largest artillery is 75 millimeter. And this is in the summer, August of 41. So rolling into the Arcadia Conference, you've got this sort of slowly maturing army, and the decision's made that we're gonna make Germany our first priority, but we don't really know where or when. Of course, we know it's going to end up being in North Africa. One of the things that you'd think would be really sort of a big deal in the preparation of the Army for this was the Desert Training Center. When I did the podcast with Sasha, the Mother of Tanks podcast, which I'll just go ahead and say she's awesome. She does amazing. Yep. It's amazing. It's one person. So she mentioned the Desert Training Center, and I thought, wow, this is something that I ought to look into a little bit more. I hadn't looked into it in a while. And there's an Army Ground Forces staff study number 15 that writes about it, and we'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. But it's not even created until the fall, or the early spring, April of 42. Around this same time, the first Armored Division and the first Infantry Division, they're doing their training out east. They're participating in the maneuvers in Louisiana and North Carolina, and they're getting ready to deploy. So First Armored Division leaves for North Ireland in May. First Infantry Division deploys to Scotland in August. There's not a lot of desert for them to train in out there, but they certainly didn't have time to participate as units in the Desert Training Center. Meanwhile, we've decided to invade North Africa. And from the point that decision's made, the planners only have about 6 weeks to put together a final plan and get it briefed to the commanders, which happens in September. And, just a month and a half later, we're invading North Africa. So it's a pretty rapid timeline and a lot of significant change. I skipped the bullet there about the reorganization. We'll talk about that a little bit. The combat command structure. This was in early 42. General McNair led an effort to reorganize Army divisions for efficiency and effectiveness. It led to this triangular structure. And so for the armored divisions, it led to this combat command structure. The point is, it was a really significant reorganization that changed the way the division fought and worked together and everything. So lots of significant stuff going on up to the last minute before this invasion.
Just a quick question for you, Mark. Yeah. One for me is, because of the relatively late date that you get armored divisions into combat, the US has had the ability to see what the British have been doing, the Italians, the Germans, the Soviets. Has that vision of what other countries are doing been a hindrance or a help? Is it too much information? It's hard to pick out ideas, or do you think it was an advantage?
Yeah, I think it's kind of noise. I mean, I think it should have been an advantage, a really significant advantage. But I think there's a lot of inward focus in the Army at the time, because so much of the emphasis is just on who's going to survive the senior officer personnel cuts. How are the different branches going to organize? Who's going to get the recruits and the equipment first? How are we going to train all these units? What is going to be this American way of fighting during the war? And I think we're certainly aware of what's going on at the front. There's all kinds of analysis being done. To what degree that information becomes intel that's useful to help units prepare for what they're going to experience at the front, I think is a really different matter. And I think the Desert Training Center provides a decent illustration of the kind of challenges you face with that. I kind of like to look at this because it's really a microcosm of all the challenges that the Army's facing trying to get ready for this war. The Desert Training Center is approved by General McNair in 1942, and you can see there the missions that it was supposed to accomplish. When they create this thing, it's referred to in this Army Ground Forces report as a war baby, because nothing existed there. There was no electricity, no water, no rail. So the first couple months at the Desert Training Center is literally just putting all this together so it can even do anything. Training doesn't start until April of 42, and all this is happening under Patton's leadership. He's the first commander. He's there until August, and then he departs and he writes this notes on tactics and techniques of desert warfare. You can find it online, and it's a pretty cool document. But if you read it, you can see what the level of focus was at this desert training center. It was really rudimentary skills. How do we survive in the desert? How do we keep our equipment working properly? What kind of techniques do we need to understand? You can't cut your wheels as sharply. You have to drive differently on the sand. These sorts of things. So there's individual and collective training going on, but it's really basic stuff. A lot of it is about fitness and just getting soldiers acclimated to the desert and to the point where they can operate, in this harsh environment. The training is supposed to be for division-sized units, but these are task forces. They're not actual divisions coming through whole cloth training and then deploying to the desert to fight. And so it's really focused on these kind of lower level things that aren't going to do things like when you fight the Germans in this kind of a situation. The British have tried these different things. They found that this works really well. And so this is going to be a great collective sort of combined arms technique to fight the Germans. They're not even close to that.
Right.
So, and then you have the whole question of, well, who even trained at the Desert Training Center? I've been looking at this for a long time. I've found a couple different copies in different archives of this Army Ground Forces Report number 15. It's supposed to have a whole bunch of appendixes, one of which lists the units that train there. I've never found a copy that has the appendixes. But with that, even without them, we know that the 1st Armored Division and the 1st Infantry Division didn't train there as divisions. They might have had personnel in North Africa that were at the Desert Training Center as part of one of these task forces that was there in the early days. But they didn't go train as a unit and then come to the desert with this unit sort of skill that they developed. And this really just reflects the severe lack of manpower that the Army's facing. By the end of 1942, we're already realizing that we can't form the number of divisions in 1943 that we planned. And this is how we end up with the 90 division gamble. We're really severely short of personnel. And one of the big shortages at the Desert Training Center is on service personnel, like, the ordnance personnel. One of the things you read in after action reports from North Africa is that soldiers were firing training ammunition and didn't realize it. Well, in training, there was a severe shortage of ordnance personnel. So many soldiers probably didn't realize there was a difference or know how to tell the difference between dummy and live tank rounds. So I could go on with this, and lack of, Army Air Corps participation in the Desert Training Center. So they're not practicing close air support or how to deal with enemy air. There are all kinds of challenges. It's interesting. By the Desert Training Center did change to the California-Arizona maneuver area, and the idea is now they can simulate a theater of operations. But this doesn't happen until well into 43. And late in 43, McNair actually recommends closing the thing. And his main concern is this lack of service forces personnel that's hampering the training. Kind of ironically, after that recommendation, the War Department decides, well, we'll just give it to the Army Service Forces, and then they'll probably support it a little bit better with service personnel. But it's a center that had a huge amount of potential. A lot of important lessons did come out of it, but how much that really affected the collective readiness of the units that fought in North Africa is really questionable.
So we have a question from Trevor, who's going to be on next week, talking about a similar subject and the lessons learned in Tunisia. And did the Desert Training Center have wadis? But I can expand on that. How much of the Desert Training Center were they actually taking notice of what the specific terrain of North Africa would be like at the point when the U.S. Army were likely to be there? Or was it just kind of sand is sand is sand?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are wadis out there. Most deserts that have this kind of mixed composition of sandy areas and then mountainous areas, they're going to be flats where when it rains, you're going to have these sort of, these temporary lakes. And then when it gets dried out again, the lakes go away and the wadis are there. I made the mistake I didn't make the mistake. My unit positioned my platoon on a wadi in Saudi Arabia while we're waiting for the Desert Storm to start. And we had a torrential rain and our helicopters were well above the landing gear in water. We were worried they were going to flood, but luckily it didn't get into the aircraft themselves. So yeah, they had that. They also had mountains. They had this kind of variety of rocky and sandy terrain. I don't think the terrain was as canalized or as severe as what you see in North Africa.
Right.
And I know that they weren't at the time we're talking about in 42. They're not really talking about how do we use the sand table to replicate the North African terrain.
A 1-to-1 scale sand table. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So, but no, that's a good question. And I think that, again, the Desert Training Center had a ton of potential. It was just another too little too late kind of an effort that didn't get in place in time to influence the stuff we're about to talk about. Okay, so I'm sure you've all heard about the race for Tunis, and this is the focus of the talk today. So I really just have this in here just to hit a couple of points. The whole idea is after the torch landings and defeat of the French resistance, to whatever degree that happened, and it was fairly minimal. Then the whole idea is to get to Tunis as quickly as possible before the Germans can really build up a strong defense there. Then we trap them in Tunisia and destroy them in detail. And what that essentially led to is this series of sort of mechanized columns racing off towards Tunis without no recon, no infantry support, no close air support, certainly. And they end up getting chewed up by German Stukas and destroyed by tanks and anti-tank units and stuff. Another thing that's important to know, though, is only CCB, Combat Command B, from the 1st Armored Division participated in Torch. The rest of the division didn't make it to Algeria until December of 42. So when we're talking about Kasserine Pass and the things that preceded it, most of the 1st Armored Division is still just arriving on the battlefield.
Right.
And this is the kind of thing. And CCB, when it deployed, it only had a battalion of Grants and 2 battalions of Stuarts. So this is not a powerful force. And over the course of this race to Tunis, CCB lost 75% of its tanks and its howitzers. Brigadier General Oliver is relieved and replaced with General Robinette, and this kind of happens a little bit later down the road. But Oliver does come back to command the 5th Division later, 5th Armored Division later. But the bottom line is, the race doesn't really end when the Allies realize that they're not going to seize Tunis before the Germans can defend it. And what I mean by that is there is a pause. There's still some fighting in December. Eisenhower is reaching for some kind of offensive action that he can make some success with. And he's not having a lot of luck. And in January, there are some sort of tentative attacks that don't go anywhere and don't work out well at all. Some bad weather comes in and there's a pause. The reason I say the race doesn't really stop is when things get going again in mid-January and in February, you still have this situation where you're bringing in additional forces. They're landing at the beachheads in Morocco or Algeria, and they're having to drive hundreds of miles to get to the front, often showing up right before the combat that they're going to participate in. You also have units like CCB taking these severe losses and having to go back and reconstitute, receive new tanks, new equipment, many replacement soldiers. And this is one of the lasting lessons that we ought to take from this campaign is the Allies' ability to reconstitute quickly after suffering severe losses and remain combat effective really is impressive. And it impressed Rommel, who later commented on it. It's not just the superiority of the equipment, it's the ability of the Allies to re-equip their units, bring in replacements, and get them back into a state where they can go back into combat as quickly as they do. It's really remarkable. And it doesn't, to me, reflect a defeated army with no morale. But we'll talk about some of that later. That's a little hint. Okay, so we get through the race for Tunis, and that doesn't really work out very well. And the focus is going to shift to central Tunisia, and this is where the action that we're going to talk about today really takes place. So just a little more context. Rommel lost the Second Battle of Alamein in November of 42, so he's moving north towards the boundary there with Tunisia. You've got the Mareth line there, and Rommel realizes that he can use this defensive position at the Mareth line to put in an economy of force defense, and then take a strong portion of his force north, link up with Jürgen von Arnim, Field Marshal von Arnim's 5th Panzer Army, and form this force to take some initiative and take the fight to the Allies and set them back. Ideally, they're gonna accomplish quite a bit with this attack, this Operation Frühlingswind that they plan, or the Spring Breeze. For their part, Eisenhower and the Allies have a plan for an operation called Operation Satin, which is going to be their own offensive. They want to drive all the way to the coast and essentially stop Rommel from linking up with Arnim, and then use this Allied force in Tunisia as the hammer to Montgomery's anvil to crush Rommel, and then turn back against the 5th Panzer Army and finish them off. Eisenhower comes back from Casablanca with orders to kind of shift to the defensive and cancel Operation Satin. He realizes that they aren't ready to do this. Just a note on the terrain. We're going to talk more about it, but you can see right there in the middle of the map, there's this open area in between two ridge lines. These are the dorsals. So you have one dorsal to the east, and it kind of runs through Fonduque and Fade Pass. Sidi Bouzid is in that area. And then you've got the western dorsal out, just to the east of Tabessa. And Kasserine Pass is right there in that western dorsal. The command setup, Eisenhower is in overall command. Things changed a little bit after Casablanca, and the British 5th Corps up north, the Ken Anderson of the British First Army now has command of the British 5th Corps in the north, the French Consolidated Corps in the center, and the American 2nd Corps in the south. And so now there's a consolidated command between Eisenhower and these three forces. So Anderson is calling the shots now. Anderson micromanaged Friedendahl terribly, and Friedendahl in turn micromanaged his subordinate units just as badly. And we'll talk about a couple examples of that as we go forward here. So I have a few slides coming up now that really kind of get into the combat action that takes place. And it's a pretty complex action that the more sources I try to bring in to inform myself on what actually happened, the more sort of conflicting accounts I have, right? And, just the other day, I was looking at the 1st Infantry Division's division history, which they deployed to Scotland in August of 42. And in the division history, they claim that in August of 42, they're the only American combat division deployed in Europe, which is just absolutely not true. So you really have to be careful as you bounce these sources off each other. And the Army official history, the Green Books, actually acknowledge that a lot of this action, the unit records don't even exist to really enable the historians to piece everything together just like it happened. But over time, the accounts have gotten a little better. The historians have managed to sort through some of the questions. And I think we have a pretty good idea what took place, but it is complex, and their units just move in piecemeal all over the battlefield throughout this whole thing. So we'll move into early February, and this really just kind of, again, is to establish the context of the things that took place before the Kasserine Pass battles. So you have Arnhem attacking in sort of the center part of the Allied line in the middle of January. CCB had just recently reconstituted, and they're actually in the process of changing command from General Oliver to General Robinette when this attack hits the French defenders near Fonduque. And the French really didn't stand any chance of being able to stand up to this. Just based on their equipment alone, they weren't going to be able to defend effectively against that kind of an attack. So Friedendahl drags his feet a little bit. He's got his own offensive desires. He wants to mount his own offensive. But he realizes that the situation is dire, and he sends CCB to reinforce the French. This does reinforce the center, and with some units sent by Anderson from the north, they're able to kind of bolster the center, and the emphasis is going to shift further south soon after this. But again, CCB is weakened and suffers casualties and equipment losses, and it reduces the forces in central. Further south along the eastern dorsal to defend there. Even after this takes place, Friedendahl is still convinced that he can mount this counterattack that he wants to do. It's an attack against McNassie. He wants to seize McNassie. And so he orders Ward to seize Sened Station, which he does successfully. But it's really a waste of effort because the situation is going to get ahead of Friedendahl, and he's not going to be able to continue this offensive. And if he had listened to his subordinate commanders, he would have instead used his resources to bolster the defenses at Fade Pass, but he didn't do that, and that is exactly where Arnhem decides to attack next. So still, we're still kind of in late January now, and when the attack comes in Fade Pass, it's another fairly quick defeat. But again, Friedendahl hesitates overnight. He thinks about it, and then finally. He creates Task Force Stark, which is 26th Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division. And then he adds CCA to that, and he sends them to Fade Pass to conduct a counterattack. This is really kind of a hopeless counterattack. It's a rapid, he quickly puts together this sort of ad hoc task force, and then he quickly sends it racing to the front with go get them, boys, good luck, have at it. The counterattack doesn't go well. Stukas harass them and destroy a bunch of their equipment on the way to the front. They suffer friendly fire on the way to the front. And when they finally get there, the Germans repulse them fairly easily. Same thing happens the next day. And so by the end of this sort of series of battles in late January, the Germans now own the Eastern Dorsal. They've seized all the passes. CCB once again has suffered a ton of losses and needs to rest and refit. And now you have most of the rest of the forces, 1st Armored Division has at its disposal in the same condition. General Ward, the commander of 1st Armored Division, is finally at the front, but a lot of his units still haven't made it. They're still trickling in. And this kind of sets the stage for the actual Kasserine Pass battles.
Okay, just a couple of questions for you, Mark, before we move on.
Okay.
So Richard O'Sullivan, who writes a lot about the Irish Brigade, and it's a potential rabbit hole, so feel free not to do a too lengthy answer, but the German reinforcement of Tunisia, was it a massive strategic error? Discuss.
I think it's just one of a series of strategic errors. Going to, we could argue going to North Africa in the first place was a strategic error. Certainly turning it into the massive scale of operations that it became over this past couple of years was a strategic mistake. I do think, though, I mean, it did give the Axis an opportunity to inflict some pretty significant damage on the Allies. If Rommel had been a little more up to his earlier form, if Arnhem had been a little more cooperative, if Kesselring hadn't just been optimistic, but also been really effective as a commander, forcing his subordinates to coordinate and work together, the Germans really could have achieved a lot with this.
I mean, it came up in the sidebar about Rommel, and as whenever Rommel comes up, there's always a big question. Was he a genius? Was he an idiot? Was he somewhere in between? And regardless of what our opinions are about him as a commander, you've got to just take into consideration he's been fighting a war there for a long time now. Him and his staff, they must just be pretty damn weary. I mean, just of just fighting. I mean, I guess they've had the odd little break here and now and then, but it's been 2 years of almost relentless combat. So I think it's taken a bit of consideration. I was going to ask you earlier, British historians, Commonwealth historians, kind of take the Battle of North Africa up to the end of Al Alamein, really, and Americans can tend to start with Torch, but of course the Germans, it's a continuation of the same campaign. Obviously, you've got the new units coming in, but they don't break it into two halves like we do by our nationalistic views. It's one big campaign for them, isn't it?
That's right, and you see the effect of this quickly. I mean, Rommel goes from being cautiously optimistic to getting really kind of excited, and then just a couple of days later, completely deflated and demoralized, and not his former self, as Kesselring described him. So at this point in the war, Rommel's very fragile, and you see this throughout the rest of his short amount of time remaining on the earth, that he's kind of got good days and bad days.
And again with Rommel, we could do an entire panel discussion. We've done entire panel discussions about his effectiveness and ultimately they're great conversations to have, but you kind of are after a while go around in circles because everyone's got an opinion and they are mostly entrenched on their opinions. And it's like when Patton comes up, it's your people have made up their minds, but the fact that we're still talking about him 80 plus years on is testament to whether or not people liked him or approve of him or think he's a great commander. He's definitely discussable.
That's right, for sure.
Anyway, back to you.
Okay, great. So Kasserine Pass battles. That's an odd name for this slide, right? But the point I'm going to make here, we're going to kind of get a little esoteric, maybe a little sort of military theory. But I really just want to make a fairly simple point, and that is to call this the Battle of Kasserine Pass. Just that alone sort of puts a weird sort of spin on the way you think about it, because it's a series of engagements or small battles that take place over a series of more than a week. And they're not even really connected in the sense that you have sort of this coherent operation that has engagements that are supposed to work in time, space, and purpose in a coordinated way to achieve a larger purpose. It's a lot of reaction, a lot of last minute stuff taking place, but it's certainly not one battle. And then the other thing is, when you do think about the Kasserine battle, well, which part of it do people tend to focus on the most? And I think that tends to be the earlier stages, which there are definitely some really embarrassing defeats in these early engagements. And I'm not at all going to try to refute that. That reveals some real weaknesses in the Allied force effectiveness for a number of reasons that we'll talk about. But if you think about what is this actually, it's really more of an operation by the Germans with a series of engagements that the Allies gradually whittle away at the Germans and ultimately stop Rommel from achieving his operational aims for this Operation Frühlingswind and send him retreating back to the rear. So that's just, one of the things that I used to, when I did staff rides a lot, and I don't get to do that stuff much anymore, but we used to do a lot of staff rides. And one of the things that I like to ask the participants was, you get to a certain point in this campaign and you talk about the latest sort of tactical actions. And then you ask, so have the Americans won yet? Or has the Union won yet? Or has the Confederacy won yet? And there's no right answer, but the point is it's a mental exercise, right? It's like, at what point in this series of engagements is the operation now decided for one side or the other, right? Yeah. And in this series of engagements, knowing now in hindsight, you see these terrible sort of embarrassing defeats in these different engagements. But if you ask the question, well, who's won yet? With the benefit of hindsight, well, the Germans haven't won yet. The 21st and 22nd of February are still coming.
Like the intellectual exercise of Latin, the language, evolving into Italian or in French. There was never a case where there were parents speaking Latin whose kids spoke French, who the parent couldn't understand their parents. It was a process of many, many generations. The same thing applies to something like the North African campaign. Is that there was a period when the Germans are winning, and there's a period where the Allies have been victorious. But exactly when it transitions, it's not a single point. It's not a set of scales that tips. It's a progressive study. And I think that's what the purpose of having a discussion like today is, that, as we said at the beginning, singling out a single action at Kasserine Pass, and as you say, they're saying, is it a victory or is it? It's not nuanced enough to understand the what's actually going on.
That's right. That's right. So with that sort of framework in mind, we'll just kind of move on now into the things that we actually think of as the Battle of Kasserine Pass. So the first of these engagements takes place at Sidi Bouzid. And this is a situation that, the Allies are just, their ass is handed to them. It really is an ugly defeat. But the defeat largely takes place because of decisions made at the higher command levels. As I mentioned, there's a lot of micromanagement going on. And so Friedendahl is very directive in how he wants his subordinate commanders to position their units down to the battalion level in some cases. He's directing how to use their different weapon systems, where to position them and how to integrate them. He's directing where to position units. So one of the things you see right early on in this attack at Sidi Bouzid is that you have an infantry regiment that's split between these two hilltops, and you can see on the map there, this regiment quickly gets surrounded. Ironically, they have bazookas. They were just issued the day before, and they're still in the boxes. They're still in their crates. They haven't had a chance to train with them, and they're up on these hills, and they get surrounded, and they don't even have a chance to fight. Some of them do manage to escape that night under cover of darkness, but most of them end up becoming prisoners. Then you still have the situation where you've got General Anderson in overall command, but he's also concerned about the north, what's going on in the north. So he, with the help of Ultra and his intel officer, he's convinced that this is just a feint. So he's really reluctant to send reinforcements, and he only sends an armor battalion to reinforce Second Corps. But he does order Friedendahl to counterattack, and this is just insanity. But Friedendahl complies with the order, and once again, his method of doing this isn't really to coordinate the battlefield with his personal presence, but it's to find the commanders that he's going to give orders to, tell them what he wants them to do, send them forward with a good luck and a pat on the back. And so there are counterattacks on the 15th. On the 15th, you have this ad hoc combat command created, CCC, under Colonel Robert Stack. And so they're linked up with the 3rd Battalion of the 1st Armored Regiment, and they race forward to try to stabilize the situation. And instead, once again, they lose most of their equipment on the way to the battle, and then what's left is quickly destroyed. 44 out of 51 Shermans are lost. And these Shermans, this unit really just recently received them. So pretty quick loss of a bunch of newer tanks on the battlefield. Then on the 16th of February, you have another counterattack that gets aborted when the 21st Panzer arrives from the southwest. And you can see that arrow kind of swinging around and coming back up from the southwest. And this triggers a rout. The American forces in the area all start streaming to the west in disarray. By the night of the 16th, there's 1,600 men are lost. Most of those from the regiment that was surrounded, but certainly not all. 100 tanks, 57 half tracks, 29 artillery pieces lost. This is an ugly defeat. And again, this is a situation in which when you drill into the details of these battles, these are individual units. These are little pieces of units that have been sent to different places of the battlefield. They've moved multiple times just in the past few days. They're trying to create ad hoc defenses or put together ad hoc attacks with units that they're not used to working with, right on the eve of actually conducting these attacks. So this isn't an effectively managed battle at all. And that I think this becomes really important when you sort of do your after action on what took place during these battles. So after this defeat at Sidi Bouzid, there's a little bit of action and then a brief pause. So you have Arnhem does some mopping up operations around Sidi Bouzid, and he pushes west to this little town of Sabetla. This is what's on the map here. There is, an attempt to defend, but pretty quickly the remnants of units around Sabetla are quickly defeated, and they retreat once again. At this point, Friedendahl finally realizes that he's not going to be able to hold on to the eastern dorsal, and he orders a retreat to the western dorsal. It's really kind of late because that retreat's already happened in the form of a rout. And Arnhem actually thinks that there's more opportunity in the north, and this starts to create some friction with Rommel. So on the 17th, there's some debate about what should we do next. And once Kesselring gets involved and makes a decision, we're going to find out that Arnhem doesn't necessarily participate or cooperate with Rommel like he should. One sort of little glimmer of hope is that the 1st Armored Division's combat commands, once this withdrawal to the western dorsal takes place, they're all actually consolidated. They're sort of operating near each other again. But still, the tally is really bad. There's another 1,100 casualties over this past couple of days. Morale's suffering, but this delaying action at Sabetla, Rommel later said that the soldiers fought cleverly and hard. So even in the midst of what people, would expect would be a really dire situation with soldiers really panicking, they're still able to put up a stiff fight. They're just under overwhelming odds that they can't overcome at this point in the battle. All right, so here we get into the
from Benjamin Allen. Sorry to interrupt you, Mark.
Sure.
From about the lack of cooperation between Arnhem and Rommel. Is it a personality clash? Is it a disagreement of doctrine, or all of the above?
Yeah, probably not doctrine. I think it's a couple of things. I think von Arnhem is kind of a classic Prussian sort of a German field marshal, and I don't necessarily think that he wants to work with Rommel. I think he sees the North not only as better strategic opportunity, but somewhere where he doesn't have to necessarily follow Rommel's drumbeat, but he can kind of have his own thing. And Rommel sees more potential in the South. Neither one of them probably is necessarily right or wrong, but somebody's got to make a decision, right? And so Kesselring is convinced by Rommel that the South has the most potential. So Arnhem decides, well, okay, then I won't follow the orders I've been given, and I'll hold back a lot of my tanks, including all of my Tigers. But yeah, I think there's the personality, what parts of German society they came from, culture, and then just that whole ego of senior commanders who want to make their mark.
And while we're doing questions, Sean Brennan has a 2-part one. You're going to elaborate on this, I'm sure, anyway. But He says bazookas nearly arrived, still in their boxes. Sherman's just assigned to a unit destroyed. If the US units were more experienced with their equipment, how much of a difference would it have made, or are the issues due to command? So essentially, is it kind of equipment and lack of experience, or is it their command complication, or again, a bit of both, or something else?
So it's both, but I won't just answer it that simply. That's a really cool question, because I think that, we talked about how during the Army maneuvers, the GHQ maneuvers, the units are fighting with equipment that's mostly going to be replaced by the time they show up at the front, and this does improve on the home front as well as improving at the front. But yeah, these soldiers not having the opportunity to train with the equipment is huge at an individual level, because soldiers that don't know how to use bazookas are going to leave them in the crate. But it's important on collective levels above that as well, because you can't fight effectively as a combined arms force if you don't know how to use your own equipment, because you have to be advanced beyond that and actually understand, how does all that other equipment work as well? And how do I use my kit to integrate with everything else in a way that maximizes its effectiveness? And then at the highest levels, you need commanders with experience seeing these units operate with the equipment they have and with their adjacent units, and in ways that are going to maximize the effectiveness of the unit. And so none of that is happening. The lack of the equipment at the lowest level is just a part of this system-wide sort of lack of experience and lack of opportunity to prepare.
And it is, the point is, that we're talking about the US's first engagement against Germans in Europe on the ground. The British and Commonwealth have been there for 2 years, and so it's not, because some of the people watching, they're British, saying, "Oh, what about this? What about that?" It's hard and maybe unfair to compare the experience the British have gained over 2 years with the learning, the steep learning curve the US are now climbing, because the British have been through that themselves, or the Commonwealth, over the previous 2 years. So it's
right.
The armies are engaging at different places on their journey, so to speak. So comparing them like side by side is a little bit unfair. But while we've got the questions, Peter O'Connell is asking one about leadership. Any comments on Eisenhower's somewhat mediocre leadership, command and control prior to and during the German counteroffensive? Anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I mean, this kind of tactical operational leadership was never Eisenhower's forte. And he did. So we talked about Sidi Bouzid and how the defensive positions were completely inappropriate. Eisenhower personally went to the front and surveyed the positions and approved them. I mean, he didn't say this is perfect, exactly what I want. He didn't say this is terrible. He just kind of okay, and off he went. Now, on the other hand, this doesn't mean that Eisenhower didn't understand this stuff. It just wasn't his focus. And so I think that it's interesting that when Eisenhower comes back from Casablanca, he appoints General Anderson in overall command of the three sort of core size elements that make up this Allied force, right? Sort of similar to having Montgomery as the overall land commander for the invasion of Normandy and D-Day up through the 1st of September when he takes command there. It's something that doesn't jump out at you from the histories, but it seems like kind of a recognition that you need somebody a little closer to the front and maybe with a little more experience. I just don't know that Anderson was necessarily the perfect guy for the job. General Alexander comes in later and sort of becomes another level of command above Anderson, which helps. But yeah, so Eisenhower, his focus isn't on running the sort of the tactical and operational level fight. And so, yeah, I think that his weakness, his lack of experience doing that kind of thing really does show in this campaign. And if he had had more battlefield experience, he probably could have, had a more effective role in helping sort of offset some of these challenges that we face.
And I will let you get on with your presentation, but Trevor Sheen is making a comment about the weather as well. Cold and wet and even sleet showers on tops of the tallest hills, miserable conditions that did not help anyone. So that's something, again, there's probably a conception that all desert fighting is sandstorms and dust and blistering heat. But of course, that's not always the case in Tunisia. There are different weather conditions as well, which is worth mentioning.
That's right. And I was just reading an account this week of a couple of the units racing from Algiers to the front. Hundreds of miles they had to go to get to the front. And as they go through the mountains, they're going through, icy, in the snow mountain passes and, trying to maneuver their tanks and other mechanized equipment on this really icy, treacherous terrain. And so there was an awesome African Stalingrad is his Twitter handle. I don't know him. I hope we meet.
That's
and
Trevor. That is Trevor. Yeah.
Is that Trevor? Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Trevor just posted today on Twitter this really neat video that shows just how high 5,000-foot hills around Kasserine Pass. I mean, this is not just, desert, knolls and wadis. This is really serious terrain that they're fighting in. And Kasserine Pass in particular, I haven't been there. I'd love to be able to go and walk the ground and maybe try.
His photos are so brilliant. I mean, he's coming on next week and he's going to use some of the photos and videos.
Oh, cool.
But I mean, jealousy was bubbling through me at an angry level. I was almost angry with jealousy.
Right. Yeah. So that's such a huge point. And I've spent a lot of time in the desert in my life, but it was deserts where in the winter you can kind of wear your long pants and a t-shirt and you're comfortable. And maybe if you get a storm, it might get a little cold and rainy for a couple of days, but it's pretty mild stuff. And this is definitely different.
Anyway, I'll let you talk now because and thanks folks for the questions. And it's getting to the point where as a channel is getting more successful, we cannot address them all. Otherwise we'd be here forever. So, but I do appreciate everybody's comments. And if you're watching this show later, keep an eye on the sidebar because there's as much amazing information coming forth from there as there is in the main show itself. You are really wonderful, Mike, you watching. So thank you a lot again. But yeah, back to you, Mark.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's one of my favorite things when I watch your shows is if I can't watch it live, it's just seeing the banter and participation in the talks. Okay, so we'll get into the 19th. At this point, Kesselring has decided that Rommel's got the best plan. He puts Rommel in overall command. He gives them command of the 10th and 21st Panzer divisions. But he also dictates the way he wants the attack to take place in the orders that he issues. So there's going to be this sort of multi-pronged attack. In this first slide, you can see the three prongs. You've got one towards Sabiba. This is the one furthest to the east. And this is one. I'll just go ahead and say now that this is one of the things that it took me an awfully long time to really sort of wake up to, is that you hear all the time about this embarrassing American defeat in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, but this is a coalition fight. The Allies are fighting this thing, and this position at Sabiba is a combined British and American position, and they execute a really skillful defense. It shows that with adequate time to prepare, these units could work together and they could do so effectively, and they could stand up to what the Axis had to offer. And so in this case, excellent use of mines and wire, anti-tank guns and artillery, all in this sort of combined arms defense, manages to hold the Germans back. If they pushed through at Sabiba, they had an open road all the way to Le Kef, and it would have been, a really ugly situation for the Allies. So these little tactical actions have really significant strategic significance, and they're not just American actions. We owe a lot to our Allied partners in being able to make our way through this thing and come out with a victory. So most of 1st Armored Division at this point on the 19th is in reserve, but that's very quickly going to change. They're going to get thrown into the fight like they have throughout this series of battles. Over a little bit to the west there at Thala, I'm probably pronouncing some of these towns wrong. I'll learn that someday too. But there you have the 26th Armored Brigade and the 26th Infantry Regiment. Again, this is another combined force. They're pushed back in this sort of fighting withdrawal, but they also manage to hold firm and they don't let the Germans break through on the 19th. Meanwhile, down south, the German Africa Corps attacks into Kasserine Pass. So there are entries and exits, right? There's two sides of this pass. And the battle that takes place over this couple of days starts obviously on the eastern end. And there's this gradual, they managed to take the eastern end, the opening to the pass. And then on the second day, they're going to manage to actually seize the pass, push the American defenders out, and then try to push out the other end towards the end of these battles. So on the 19th, the defenders in the pass, and this is just remarkable to me. The main unit is the 19th Combat Engineer Battalion, and they're working with a battalion of the 26th Infantry Division. This Combat Engineer Battalion hadn't engaged in any combat up to this point in the North African campaign. So this is their first combat, and they're thrown into the Kasserine Pass after the Germans have seized the entry to the pass to defend it. And remarkably, they're able to hold out the whole day. They didn't even finish their rifle training in the States before they deployed to the front. And they're able to hold for a day. And this is probably, in my view, if you want to ask, so at what point do the Americans win? Really the Allies, right? Because we're trying to reframe the narrative on this thing. I think the Allies win or begin to win on the 20th, when the delay in Kasserine Pass itself enables forces that are heading to the front from Algiers and who are in the area but need to reposition. It enables them to get in position and bolster these 3 different locations where they're defending, and turn the tide here in the next couple of days. So on the 20th, though, Rommel does finally break the defense of these 2 battalions in the pass itself. And so now, by the end of the 20th, Rommel owns the passes, the entry and exits to Kasserine Pass itself. But like I said, the thing that's really important is the delay, the time it took for that to happen, has enabled some pretty cool things to happen on the Allied side. So one thing that's taken place, you've had some of this happens on the 19th and some on the 20th, but you have some command and control changes. On the 19th, General Anderson places Charles Dunphy's 26th Armored Brigade under 2nd Corps. He's trying to consolidate the command a little bit. So you have orders coming from, one headquarters and trickling down through them, and not separate headquarters making separate decisions. Once Dunphy is under 2nd Corps command, he immediately drives down to the location you can see on the map there where Task Force Stark is located. This is on the 19th. This is while they're still fighting for Kasserine Pass itself. Stark tells Dunphy he's doing great. He doesn't need any help, but Dunphy senses otherwise. And when he gets back to his headquarters, he builds a task force and a battalion of tanks and a battalion of infantry, and he sends it to reinforce Stark. By the end of the day on the 20th, all those tanks are lost, and a lot of those troops have either retreated or become casualties. But it's exactly what the Americans and Task Force Stark needed to enable them to delay. So, like I said, this is a coalition fight. It's combined operations, and we really owe a lot to the Allies that helped us keep this thing going. On the 20th, you have some more command changes. So Friedendahl gives Dunphy overall command of all the forces around Thela and involved in that defense. That includes CCB, but it doesn't include the 1st Infantry Division. And you can see the 1st Infantry Division, they're rolling in, kind of occupying this position to the southwest of sort of the open part of Kasserine Pass. You can see them there. So you've got 1st Infantry Division on that part, and they're basically up on the high ground. And what that's going to do is it's going to force the Germans, the Axis forces, I keep saying German, the Axis forces, to exit their vehicles and move dismounted into the high ground for this fight. And it's going to take away a lot of their advantage in mechanized equipment. So with Dunphy and overall command around Thela, Ward now, again, is experiencing having his combat commands sort of taken away from him or given to other people to command. And we'll talk a little bit about how this all plays out for Ward in a minute. Anderson also put Brigadier General Cameron Nicholson of the 6th Armored Brigade over Dunphy. And what he was trying to do is ensure that there's an officer with seniority to avoid any conflicts between Robinette and Dunphy that might take place. And so Nicholson, once he's in command, he holds a meeting early morning hours on the 21st to sort of coordinate this defense. So now you actually, for the first time in all of these battles, all these engagements we've talked about, you have some kind of, logical command and control, integration between units. You still have a lot of units moving around quickly to get to where they need to be on the battlefield, but there's some kind of organized defense there waiting for them to reinforce. They're not just showing up onto an active battlefield. So the whole situation is drastically different at this point. And so you start to see a real change in the way things play out. I'll take just a second to talk a little bit about how this all plays out. Like I said, I wrote my master's thesis on this, and what I was really just trying to do, my thesis was what caused this embarrassing defeat of the Americans in Tunisia, and I had 3 things, and I kind of analyze which thing was the cause. So my thesis statement is this is an embarrassing defeat, and that whole thing just frames the rest of the analysis, right? Your whole approach to studying it. But then when I started working on General McNair, and I wrote my book on General McNair, I learned all about his efforts to improve the Army's ability to use artillery effectively and to fire mass fires from different points. And artillery is one of the main stories of this series of battles. And we'll talk about a couple specific examples. But the ability of the U.S. Army to move their artillery quickly, put it in position, register fires, and then deliver this incredibly effective massed fires. I think they had about 50 guns on the ridgeline. I know it was on the order of 50 guns. So the Germans are just getting pummeled by this artillery, and the defense is a really skillfully developed combined arms defense with all the weapon systems integrated properly, and everything being done according to the doctrine. Now, how did they even figure this out, right? I mean, these units hadn't had a chance to work on this together. They did have their experience from the maneuvers and then from their other collective training they did while they were waiting to go into action for the first time. But they've never really had a chance to practice this on anything like this scale. But they're still able to pull off this really incredible defense. So just as an example, when Rommel attacks on the 21st, he probes at Sabiba. There's no success up there, and they quickly abandon that. The attack at Thala shows a little bit more promise, but it's the defense is skillfully executed. The whole day there's this sort of fighting withdrawal, and one of the main things that Dunphy says enables him to pull this off is the arrival of a field artillery battalion from the 9th Infantry Division. So the 34th Field Artillery. And one of the cool things about this story is General Harmon is ordered by General Anderson to take his division north to reinforce what's going on up in the north. And Harmon complies with the order, but he knows that they're probably going to need this artillery in this situation that's developing in the south. So he just sort of forgets to order his artillery to go with. And so when this battle starts at Thala, the 34th Field Artillery Battalion moves down there, gets there just in time to start sort of doing this bounding field artillery support as they fight this fighting withdrawal. And Dunphy says that's exactly what they needed. That field artillery enabled them to hold out all day, and that attack goes nowhere. As far as the CCB and 1st Armored Division defense, same thing. I've already talked about the skill of the position. And these guys, they're not dealing with amateurs. They're attacked by Panzer Grenadier Regiment Africa, part of the 8th Panzer Regiment and Division Centauro of the German Africa Corps. I mean, these are highly experienced units. And this defense on the south and west portions of the pass, it stops the Germans in their tracks. It takes most of the day, but over time, the Grenadiers are forced to go to ground. They can't advance any further, but they also can't retreat because they're bracketed by artillery. The armor is stopped and suffers severe losses, and finally Rommel realizes that this isn't working, and he orders a retreat. There is a little bit more action on the morning of the 22nd. Remnants of the 10th Panzer Division attempt one more probe up at Sabiba. That's quickly halted. Artillery again is a key part of that. And at this point, Rommel realizes that he's beaten, and he orders a general retreat. Now, when you read the accounts of this engagement, you generally read that at this point he's short on fuel and ammo and food, and that's true. But he wasn't out of any of those things. He probably could have gone at least a full day. I believe he had a full day's worth of ammo and 4 days worth of fuel. I might have that reversed. But what he also had was he had Tebessa. Tebessa is 2nd Corps' headquarters. And if he had managed to push through the exit of the pass and get to Tebessa, he's got the entire Corps rear area with all of the lickies and chewies that you could ever hope for in the various ammo and fuel dumps and everything back there. So I think any logistics officer advising Rommel probably would have said, if we have it in us, another day's push and we're at Tebessa and we can replenish our supplies. I think he's just beaten. So in my view, the Kasserine Pass battles end in an Allied victory, and it is definitely an Allied victory, as I've tried to kind of highlight. and so then you have to ask the question, okay, so yeah, but it was a Pyrrhic victory, certainly, right? It was a very costly victory. But what's the takeaway? What can we learn from this, right? So I'll pause for just a second in case there are any questions you wanted to handle. But these are the last things I kind of wanted to go through.
Yeah, no, there's a few comments rather than questions. So again,
Okay.
emphasizing the Allied nature, Merdio Lou 81 is saying the 6th British Armored Division's Lothians and Leicester battalions literally checked and repulsed 10th Panzer Division until 9th US Division came to reinforce with artillery fire. Gary Giamara is saying, I'll go find it now. There's so many comments, got to try and find it all now. He's talking about a presentation by Robert Citino saying that he's read 200 German accounts of these battles, including one, and they all agree that American artillery was devastating. So maybe there's been some guilt at looking at this battle from the Allied losses point of view, as opposed to what's happening to the German forces there. And then another comment I'll scroll down to, and it's from Trevor again. The artillery battalion CO was Lieutenant Westmoreland, who went on to become the U.S. Army Supreme Commander in Vietnam. So, a good name. He also talked about the fact that in Thala, the headquarters was also the brothel. That was another comment he made earlier, Trevor. So, all sorts of information comes in the sidebar. We not just get battlefield analysis. It's also which buildings were the brothels. So, people are just emphasizing the fact that, and it's the international nature of the audience today, is that it's an Allied operation, which I suppose is the I know I'll let you talk about it. This is the learning curve. This is Torch, and everything that happened post Torch is all the proving ground for what eventually the Allies take to Normandy, they take to Italy, and build on.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just a remarkable story, really.
Yeah.
Okay, so these are just some bullets of things that just to kind of sum up and then to talk about what all this kind of means to me. One of the things that I kind of most object to in the standard analysis of what led to the defeats in these engagements is this idea that it was mostly or largely because the American troops were green. They were hopelessly trained, undisciplined, inexperienced, obviously. And were there green soldiers in this campaign? Absolutely. I would argue, though, that one thing to think about is that there were green soldiers in every single campaign that the Americans fought, because we're constantly sending new divisions to the front. We're having to resort to large numbers of replacements. So these units are having a lot of turnover. And, we talk about this kind of stuff all the time, how young battalion commanders were, the casualty rate of a regiment in the ETO, 200% over the course of the campaign. So there are always green units or green soldiers in these units. And it's absolutely true, as we've talked about, that these folks were inexperienced and didn't have the best equipment, or they didn't have much experience with the equipment that they did have. But as I've tried to highlight, as we kind of went through the actions that took place, the soldiers never lost their fighting spirit, their will to fight. There were plenty of cases in which they're quickly overwhelmed by attacking mechanized German forces, and they panic and retreat. I would do the same thing probably. When you see that it's hopeless, you preserve your combat power and live to fight another day, right? But they always manage to make their way back into combat. And I've never seen any evidence that there was any more serious a desertion rate or a combat stress, or whatever you want to call it, rate in this campaign than any other. I think the troops performed admirably in the situation they were in, which largely was a bad situation because of just the nature of the campaign is just this kind of constant race, and then these really bad decisions made at the higher organizational levels that put them in these sort of untenable tactical situations. So it's not, in my view, just that the troops were green.
And to interrupt again, it's
Sure.
One of the things on World War II TV is the loaded nature of terms. It came up in the show recently about glider pilots and how they're often referred to as washouts from other and it comes with this connotation. It comes with a negativity, and we could easily replace the word green with inexperienced or fresh.
Right.
There's all sorts of synonyms that don't come with the same loaded thing. That when we read account, we go green. Oh, that's bad. I mean, the 29th Division on Omaha Beach were green, weren't they? The British, units in places were green. Green doesn't always equate to being bad. It's just something that we,
That's right.
the readers and consumers of military history, have come to add weight to that term beyond what it's often meant as.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, it generates this kind of mental model that shapes the way you interpret what you're reading about, for sure. So just an example that I've thought about. The last time I kind of prepared for this, and I talked with Sasha, Mother of Tanks, about this. I had recently done some work on the Battle of the Bulge, and the Battle of the Bulge. How often, I wonder, does anybody see the Battle of the Bulge described as an embarrassing defeat for the Allies? Right? I mean, there are intelligence failures and other things that lead to this sort of lack of preparedness for this German counteroffensive that has some really significant initial successes, but then after a period of a while, and some engagements to take place. I mean, there's regiments that literally are written off, that cease to exist. There are 80,000 U.S. casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, 19,000 dead, and yet this is. I mean, if you just described in generic terms these two different series of battles, the narrative is essentially the same: embarrassing defeat, tide starts to turn, we win, right? But the general interpretation of Battle of the Bulge is this amazing Allied victory, and the general interpretation of North Africa is this really embarrassing American defeat because they're so inexperienced and poorly trained and everything else. So it's all, to me, it just reinforces how important it is to kind of think about historical memory and how narratives are formed in this sort of collective way and gain this traction, and then influence the way we think about these campaigns. So just on the equipment deficiencies and close air support, I mean, we know that there are all kinds of things that we could talk about in terms of the quality of the equipment. The Americans absolutely didn't have individual tanks that were on par with the Germans, and you could argue that they didn't throughout the war. The Americans had a really, really significant sustainment and strategic logistics issue. I mean, we're providing this equipment all over the globe, over vast oceans. We're having to build the fleet that's going to transport this stuff while we're building the equipment and shipping it. And the people that we need to be sending to the front to fight are the same people that we need to keep in the home front to build all this stuff. So a good tank for the Americans was a tank that's reasonably effective and that we can get to the front in reasonable numbers. So I could go on about that, but to me, it just reinforces the fact that you must have had some pretty effective leadership and some pretty good training for the soldiers that you're talking about to even be able to overcome these deficiencies. The lack of close air support, and they're fighting under German air superiority the entire time. And we know how critical German air superiority or American air superiority in the battle for France was, right? The battle for Normandy. So just think about that. They have complete air superiority throughout this whole series of battles. And then on the other side of it, you talk about artillery effectiveness. And again, this isn't just that we have the best equipment. This was an intellectual effort that took place over the entire interwar period. I mean, McNair was writing about how do we improve artillery ability to move with attacking units and support units in the attack while he's with the AEF in France during World War I. And so here, 20 years later, some of his ideas are finally coming to fruition. So the equipment is important, but it's the procedures and the doctrine that really makes the artillery as effective as it is. And then I think just another really important takeaway is the impact on the U.S.-British relationship. The Brits and the United States really walk away from this with some real friction with each other. I think Gerhard Weinberg put it best when he said that, instead of taking the lesson that the Americans were able to go from this really inexperienced sort of body that couldn't get anything right to being able to make the 21st of February happen in such a short period of time and in such a chaotic situation. The British could have interpreted that one of two ways. They could have said, wow, yeah, they had some issues when they showed up, but look what they were able to pull off. This is really impressive. Instead, they took the lesson that, okay, we're really going to have to watch these Americans because they don't know what they're doing and their soldiers are hopeless. And I imagine that, when you talk about El Guitar and the other stuff that comes later, you're going to hear some more of this where, Alexander is trying to give the Americans these really limited objective things to do so they can take baby steps, right, to getting. I mean, it's really interesting how the rest of the war, you kind of have this leftover concern about each other's effectiveness. The Americans, the same thing. You know, they're complaining about Montgomery moving slowly to the Mareth line. They're, you know, so some of the roots of this conflict in the Anglo-American coalition, you can see it forming here, and it's really unfortunate because it could have gone completely differently.
And it was kind of top down, wasn't it? I mean, there are other occasions in the war where the relationships perhaps between commanders was better than between the men on the ground, or vice versa. But from Torch onwards, I mean, just in how to deal with Vichy, the Americans and Brits can't agree on that, right in the planning, and then from Torch and the politics, right down to, you know, Richard O'Sullivan's watching, whose dad was there with the 38th Infantry, Infantry Brigade. At the actual soldiers level, there was friction. So it's kind of top down on all levels. And yet, and this is what we talked about with Sasha, you know, a year later, when it gets to Overlord, most of that has been ironed out. I mean, obviously it wasn't completely smooth sailing from it, but most of it has been addressed and rectified, and Eisenhower has learned, you know, from this, as most of the commanders have. So you can definitely see that it's part of it was a low point, but it's a low point from which everyone recovers reasonably quickly.
That's right. Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah, and so then I guess just the last sort of takeaway for me is just this whole idea of the power of historical narrative. And there's a fantastic book by an author named John Lewis Gaddis that it's one of these books like John Block and you know, some of the other great historians who've written about what it is that historians do. But what Gaddis is trying to do is describe the way, how the ability historians have to relate a narrative in a way that you could never get at the time, right? So simultaneity, you can describe events taking place at the same time in two different locations that the people involved never could have really experienced those two events simultaneously, but we can experience them simultaneously now in how we read it. You can zoom out or you can zoom in scale, so you can show these little tiny tactical actions and then talk about what's happening at the strategic level. But they couldn't be aware of each other in the same way at the time that we can be now in our histories. So there are all kinds of ways that, as historians write, they can craft the narrative in a way that can distort people's perceptions, and they might do it intentionally or they might do it unintentionally. But I think it's important, for me at least, I feel like I always need to keep part of my brain a little bit above the action when I'm reading history, so I can think about, you know, what is the historian doing with this right now, and you know, and how is the approach to the narrative influencing the way I'm interpreting it, right? So I think the main thing that this has taught me over the years, in addition to learning a lot of really fascinating things about an amazing campaign, is it's just caused me to reflect a little bit more, that, you know, on how I do what I do when I try to write. What am I trying to generate with my story, and then how do I craft the narrative in a way that's not going to distort it, but that's going to emphasize it in an appropriate way to the reader. And you know, and I think there are a lot of fantastic histories of what went on in North Africa that will still give you some of these kind of distorted views on, you know, what actually took place, but the facts in there are still really, really useful, right? And so you kind of have these different purposes and ways to interpret histories. That's just really interesting to me, and this campaign brings that out really well. So that's all the stuff I wanted to talk about. But
no, thank you.
Whatever you have.
Essentially, what we're doing, Mark, you're doing with the writing and the work you do professionally, and what I'm doing here is you're not necessarily we're not telling people the history. In some ways, we're giving people the tools of how to interpret it themselves. We're trying to remind people to be objective and just take a step back and to try and remove their national bias, try and remove what they think they know about things, and try and kind of sweep away all that and try and embrace some of these engagements that we think we're familiar with fresh eyes. And it's natural. I have to fight against my natural urges to believe what I think I've been believing for 50 years because they're so ingrained. And to me it's an active process to keep myself looking at things freshly and going. And when someone emails me and says, I've got a different view about something, I read it and I go, and it's against what I thought. And I start getting I kind of react negative. I go, no, and then I go, no, hang on, Paul,
Right,
you're not putting this through a process. Read it, take a deep breath. There's someone giving you a different version of things, and usually when I've calmed down and counted to 10, I realize there's merit in what the person is saying. It just I've dug my heels in.
Right, that's right. Yeah, it's fun stuff, but you do sometimes you have to kind of take a breath. Yeah.
No, brilliant. I think we will end things there because there'll be some great comments and things in the discussion there. And Mark, people are just saying that you're a great product of the American military training and also your training as a historian and how great you are. And they like your your soft Kansas cadence or something. Someone said was very nice, but. The thing is, these discussions about the wider context of the Tunisian campaign, you can't just say, well, we've done it, we finished it. There's endless permutations, there's endless routes you can go down and discussions, and that's what makes it interesting, I think.
Absolutely. There's always more that you can learn. That's right.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, we'll leave it there, and I'll just now we'll think of any reason to bring you back. Do you want to do something husky with me in July?
I think my buddy John Curatola would be a better call for that one.
I think I've got it lined up. I haven't actually thought about the husky shows yet, except that I'm going to be doing 2 or 3 weeks. But brilliant stuff. So, Mark, enjoy New Orleans and your rain this morning, and folks, I will see you all again tomorrow when we're doing a deeper dive on one of the particular tank battalions that came ashore in Operation Torch. I'm looking forward to that with Jeff Danby, and then I'll be getting the ready for the next shows next week. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, viewers. I will see you all tomorrow. This is Paul Burnett for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.